The wind had a name on the North Reach, and the old charts called it the Widowmaker, because it did not blow so much as it hunted along the cliffs for anything warm and unwatched. On the night it came back after 7 quiet years, it found the storm spire empty as it had been for 2 centuries, a black throat of stone that no shepherd and no soldier and no priest had ever slept inside and lived to describe. And high above that throat, cutting sideways through rain that fell like nails, a dragon flew with its wings half closed against the gale, not away from the coast as every other living thing was trying to do, but straight toward the one light still burning. That light belonged to Mara Quill, and it had no business burning anymore, because the imperial stipend had stopped 3 winters ago, and the oil was her own, and the cliff was eating an inch more of her yard every spring. She had kept it anyway, because her husband had kept it before he fell from the ladder in a gale just like this, and, because somewhere beyond the white water, there were still fishing boats that did not know the charts had changed. She worked with hands that knew every knot and shutter by feel, tying down the goat shed, hammering a second board over the lantern room, talking to the storm the way you talk to a drunk relative who has come back to the house again. The spire watched all of it, and the dragon watched the spire, because the spire was his, and it had been his alone since his grandfather's time, and no creature had ever been permitted to lay its head down inside it and wake again. The law was not written in books but in bone, because the last man who tried to claim the spire for shelter had been found in spring with his eyes open and his body cold, not killed but refused, as if the mountain itself had decided he did not belong. For 200 years the Empire had told that story to keep thieves away from the Emperor's private roost, and for 200 years it had been true in a way that made even generals look away from the cliffs. High in the gale, the dragon banked and the rain turned to steam on his back for an instant, because his blood ran hotter than any forge the coast had ever built. He had passed the palace. He had passed the garrison towers. He had passed 3 imperial chapels built to receive him in a storm, and he had chosen none of them, because none of them held what he had been watching for 3 years without ever landing. Down below, the little square of light that should have been dark years ago was still burning, and in it, a woman in a patched oilskin was lifting a full can of lamp oil up a ladder with her teeth clenched around the handle because her hands were needed to hold on. Mara had learned early that courage is not a feeling but a chore list that you do not put down when the wind tries to take it from your hands. She had already checked the seawall. She had already moved the dry wood onto the table. She had already tied her husband's old hammer to her wrist with twine, so she would not lose it when the shutter nails tore free again. Her house was not a house anymore, but a working lighthouse that had been demoted by the Empire to a rock with a lamp, and she kept it because if she did not, the next storm would take a boat without even the courtesy of a warning. She was 32, and her hair had gone gray at the temples the winter her husband died, not from age but from holding a lamp alone through nights when the dark felt personal. She did not see the dragon at first, because sensible people do not look up in a widowmaker. They look at the board in front of them, and the knot in front of that. The first sign was the gulls going silent all at once, as if someone had put a hand over the sky, and the second sign was the goats going still in their shed and pressing together without bleeding, which they only did when something older than weather was passing over. When she finally looked, it was already low, impossibly low, its belly almost brushing the beacon light, its wings making the rain run sideways, and she understood in a single cold second that the stories about the spire being empty were only half true. She did not run, not because she was brave in the way bards sing about, but because there was nowhere to run that the wind would not find her faster than any winged thing could. She put her back to the lantern room and put her hand on the rail and made herself keep breathing, because she had once watched her husband try to outrun a squall, and she knew that panic is heavier than water when it fills your boots. The dragon circled once, twice, its eye catching the lantern light and throwing it back amber, and Mara realized it was not looking at her, but at the light itself, the way a lost man looks at a fire he thought had gone out years ago. She lifted the shutter to shield the flame, and shouted without thinking, "You will have to wait your turn. I am not done yet." And the absurdity of scolding a legend the size of a fishing trawler in the middle of a hurricane would have made her laugh if her teeth had not been chattering. The dragon made a sound that was not a roar, but a low thrum that she felt in the soles of her feet through the stone, and it hovered, waiting, as if it had been taught manners by someone who had long ago left the coast. The Widowmaker did not build slowly. It arrived all at once, as if it had been holding its breath just offshore, and decided to let it go. The first gust took the goat shed door, and the second gust took half the roof with it, not ripping but lifting, as if the wind had hands and had finally gotten tired of being polite. Mara lunged for the lantern chain because a dark beacon in a storm like this was not an inconvenience, but a death sentence for anyone still on the water, and the chain burned her palms even through the oilskin because the lamp had been burning hot for hours. She got the light secured, and turned just in time to see the western wall of her tower shudder, lean, and give up the argument it had been having with the cliff since her grandfather built it. She fell with it, not far, but far enough to have the wind knocked out of her, and the rain knocked into her mouth and nose, until she could not tell which was sea and which was sky. The stones came down around her, not on her, because the old mortar broke clean, and she lay for a moment in the sudden, shocking cold of the open gale with her tower gone, and her light still burning above her on its iron pole, miraculously still lit, still stupidly, stubbornly lit. The goats were screaming now, and she tried to get up, and her ankle told her in a bright, specific way that it would not be helping with that plan. It was then that the dragon stopped waiting, because there are courtesies, and then there are moments when courtesy becomes cruelty if it keeps you hovering while someone drowns. He dropped the last 20 feet like a stone deciding to be gentle, his claws splaying at the last instant to take not the stone but the air around her, and the wind vanished as if someone had closed a door on it. Mara felt heat, then pressure, then a strange, awful softness, as if she had been picked up by a storm that had changed its mind about what it wanted to destroy. He did not grab her like prey. He scooped her like a mother cat takes a kitten that has rolled too far from the nest, his foreleg curling under her back, and his wing coming over her like a roof made of living leather. She tried to fight because that is what you do when something huge closes around you, but his scales were hot, and the rain that had been needling her face a second ago was now hissing off him into steam. Through the steam she heard her own voice, raw. "Put me down. The light. You have to." And she felt him rumble again, not in anger but in answer, and then the ground fell away. No one who had ever seen a dragon carry a person had lived to describe whether it was fast or slow, because terror makes poor timekeepers of us all. For Mara it was both, the cliff rushing away below and the beacon light getting smaller until it was the only star left in a world that had otherwise gone black and wet and roaring. She clutched at nothing and then, because her hands needed something true to hold, at the edge of the scale under her cheek, which was warm and ridged and vibrated faintly with each massive downstroke. The spire came toward them, or they toward it, and she understood then where he was taking her, and why no one had ever slept in the lair and lived to tell it. The mouth of the storm spire was not a cave, but a wound in the cliff that the sea had tried and failed to close for 1,000,000 years, and the wind that lived inside it sang even when the world outside was calm. He slipped inside sideways, wings folded, and the sound changed from howl to hush in a single heartbeat, as if the mountain had swallowed them to keep them secret. Inside, it was dry and impossibly warm, the stone itself radiating heat like a bread oven left banked overnight, and the air smelled of old smoke and rain on hot iron, and something else she could not name but that made her eyes sting. He set her down not on cold stone, but on a deep bed of what looked at first like gray sand, and then, when her eyes adjusted, like a century of shed scales, each one soft at the edges and warm from the rock beneath. Mara tried to stand, and her ankle gave and she went down again, and this time the dragon lowered his massive head until his eye was level with hers, close enough that she could see her own small, soaked reflection warped in its amber. She lifted a shaking hand before she could think better of it, and touched the hot ridge above his nostril, because she had spent her life fixing small broken things with her hands, and he went utterly still for her. "You cannot keep me here," she whispered, not because she thought he would understand the words, but because saying something ordinary made the extraordinary less likely to kill her, The boats will need the light, and I have goats." He blinked, slow, and then he did something no imperial chronicle had ever recorded, and no emperor had ever permitted. He curled his body around the scale bed and tucked his wing over her like a blanket, shutting out the mouth of the lair and the storm beyond it. He had never let anyone sleep in his lair. He carried her in from the storm himself. She woke because the pain in her ankle had dulled to a throb, and because it was too quiet, which is the kind of quiet that comes only when a storm has decided to stay for a while and has settled in to wait you out. The lair glowed faintly, not from any fire but from veins in the stone that pulsed amber when the dragon breathed, and in that low light she could see the true size of where she was. Not a den but a hall, high enough to hold a fishing boat upright with room to spare. The floor was dry, the air was warm, and somewhere behind the curve of his wing she could hear water dripping the way it does in safe places. Mara sat up slowly and took stock the way she had been taught in the gray fever years, when she had nursed her husband through a winter that took half the village, checking breath, checking heat, checking what could be moved and what must be left alone. Her ankle was swollen to twice its size but not broken, her hands were scraped raw, her oilskin was gone, and she was wrapped in what felt like an ancient sail that smelled faintly of smoke. The dragon was awake, she could tell by the rhythm of his breathing, but he did not move his wing. He let her look, as if he understood that a woman who keeps a light needs to see the shape of the room she has been put in to keep from panicking. She spoke to him because silence, in a place that big, felt like a dare. "You are warmer than my oven, do you know that?" And her voice cracked, because her throat was dry from swallowing rain. "My mother used to say a good oven is the heart of a house, but I have never met a house that breathes." He made that low thrum again, and shifted just enough to let a little more light in from the fissure near the ceiling, and in that light she saw the walls were not bare at all but carved with names, hundreds of them, shallow and deep, some in hands that shook. She ran her fingers over the nearest one without thinking, and felt the stone still warm from the carving, as if the hand that made it had only just left. She read the old northern letters aloud, stumbling, "For Joran who watched, for Miri who waited," and the list went on. Not trophies but debts, and she understood with a lurch that this was not a monster's hoard, but a ledger. The dragon watched her read and lowered his head again, and this time when she touched him she did not flinch at the heat. "You keep your promises in stone," she murmured, and she thought of her own small light that she had kept burning without pay, without thanks, without anyone writing her name anywhere. "I kept mine in oil and glass." The storm did not break by morning, it doubled, because the Widowmaker is a storm that likes to finish what it starts, and it had been interrupted. Inside the spire, time moved differently, measured not in bells but in breaths and drips, and the slow change of light through the high fissure, and Mara began to understand why no one had ever been allowed to sleep here. It was not that the lair killed, it was that it remembered. And to sleep inside someone else's memory without permission is a kind of trespass that cold mountains do not forgive. But she had been carried, not taken, and that difference seemed to matter to the stone. She found a shallow pool near the back, warm enough to steam, and she cleaned her hands and her ankle and drank because the water tasted of minerals and heat, and not of salt, which meant it came from deep and not from the sea. While she worked, the dragon brought things, not gold, not jewels, but useful things, a bundle of dry driftwood in his teeth that he set down as carefully as a man might set down a child, a sealskin that smelled of smoke, a tin cup that was dented but whole. Each offering landed with a soft thump on the scale bed, and each time he looked away after, as if embarrassed by his own thoughtfulness. "Where did you get a cup?" she asked, turning it over in her hands and finding initials scratched into the bottom that were not hers. "Did you steal this from some poor shepherd too?" He huffed, and a puff of hot air ruffled her damp hair, and he nudged the driftwood closer with his nose, clearly prouder of the wood than the cup. She laughed before she could stop herself, a short, surprised sound that hurt her throat, and she fed a piece of wood into a natural hollow, where old ash lay, and he lit it with a careful, sideways breath that made the flame catch without scorching her fingers. They sat like that for a long while, a woman and a dragon sharing a small fire in a hall built for legends, and outside the mouth of the lair the widowmaker howled because it could not get in. Mara fed the fire and talked because she had not talked to anyone in 3 years except goats and the occasional gull, and the dragon listened the way only very old things can listen, without interrupting, without needing to answer. She told him about the tower and the light, and the husband who fell, and he told her nothing in words, and everything in the way his wings stayed over her, even when the fire was warm enough. It was on the second night, when the storm had settled into a steady, sullen roar, and her ankle had gone down enough that she could hobble, that the dragon finally moved away from the mouth and into the deeper dark of the lair. He returned with something in his claws that made Mara's breath stop, not because it was frightening, but because it was impossibly familiar. A small, oil-stained book with a leather tie that had swollen shut with sea air. She knew that book because she had tied that tie herself 3 winters ago and thrown it into the sea from the cliff when the letter inside it came back unopened with a palace seal that said no longer required. She took it with hands that shook and untied the knot, and inside were her own careful logs, her own small handwriting, nights and weathers and ships sighted. 3 years of a light kept burning for no pay. On the last page, in a different ink that had bled a little with damp, someone had written 4 words in imperial script. I saw it burning, and underneath, in a hurried scrawl, I found my way home by it. The memory came back to her then, not as a story, but as weather does, all at once, the night 3 years ago, when the storm had been almost this bad, and she had thought she saw something huge fall from the sky beyond the point, something that cried out with a voice that was not quite animal. She had kept the light extra bright that night, feeding it oil she could not afford, because she thought if something was dying out there, it should at least die able to see where the rocks were. You were lost, she whispered, and she looked up at the dragon with tears making clean tracks through the soot on her face. You were out there, and you were hurt, and you saw my little light and you... She could not finish, because the scale of it was too big for a woman who thought her work was small. The dragon lowered his head and pressed his forehead, hard and hot and impossibly gentle, against her shoulder, and the book fell from her hands into the warm sand. He had flown 11 miles past palaces and temples and garrisons with a shattered wing once, just to collapse at the door of the one person who gave without knowing who she was giving to, and now he had flown again, not with a broken wing but with a full heart, to carry that same person out of a storm that would have taken her. On the 3rd morning the wind changed, not dying but shifting east, which on the north reach means the worst is over and the sea will start to give back what it took. Mara woke, and the wing over her was gone, and the mouth of the lair was open, and gray light was coming in, and for a terrible moment she thought he had left her the way legends leave people, without goodbye. Then she saw the shape at the entrance, backlit by stormlight, too small to be a dragon, and too still to be a man waiting to be invited in. He stood with his back to her, his hands braced on the stone on either side of the mouth, as if he needed the mountain to hold him up, and his hair was black and wet, and his shoulders were broad under a simple, travel-torn black coat that steamed faintly in the warm air. He was barefoot, and his feet were pale against the warm stone, and she could see old scars lacing up the back of his neck that caught the light like thin silver wires. When he finally turned, she knew him without ever having seen his face, because there are people you know by the way they have watched over you, even when you thought you were alone. Your ankle, he said, and his voice was low and rough from disuse, and from breathing fire in a way that human throats were never meant to do. I flew too fast. I did not. He stopped, and swallowed, and tried again, stepping forward, and then stopping himself, because he had spent 200 years learning that his lair was not for others, and 3 days unlearning it all at once. Mara pushed herself up on her good foot and limped toward him before he could decide to be an emperor instead of a man. You kept my book, she said, and she was not talking about the logbook, but about the way he had kept the promise written in its margin, and she reached up and put her cold hands on either side of his hot, rain-wet face, because someone needed to be the one who was not afraid to touch first. He leaned into her touch like a starving man leaning into bread, and his eyes, which were amber even in human form, slipped closed for a second, as if the simple pressure of her palms was a kind of permission he had been waiting 2 centuries to receive. "I have never let anyone sleep here," he admitted, and the words were a confession dragged from somewhere deep and defended. "Not my generals, not my council, not my own brother when he begged shelter in winter, because this place it was." He opened his eyes and looked at her, truly looked, and the emperor fell away, and only Calum remained, a man who had carried a woman through a hurricane because he could not stand the thought of her light going out. He told her then, in fits and starts the way men who do not talk often tell important things, what he had heard from the cliff for 3 years while he circled and did not land. He told her about hearing her sing off-key to the goats while she mended nets, about hearing her argue with the lantern as if it were a stubborn child, about hearing her cry once, only once, on the anniversary of her husband's fall, and then wipe her face and relight the wick. He told her that every other light on the coast went dark when the Empire stopped paying, but hers stayed, and that a dragon who had spent his life being approached for favor had finally found a human who kept a promise when there was nothing left to gain by keeping it. Mara listened and fed him water from the tin cup he had stolen for her, and she laughed wetly when he tried to explain that he had watched her for so long because he was trying to understand what kind of creature works without reward. "We call it stubbornness where I come from," she told him, poking his chest with a finger that left a small, damp print on his shirt. "My mother called it being too stupid to know when you are beaten, which is the same thing as courage if you squint." He caught her hand and held it against his heart, which beat too fast for an emperor, and just right for a man who had finally landed. Outside, the storm was breaking up into ragged clouds that raced each other toward the horizon, and through the mouth of the spire she could see a thin, miraculous bar of blue, and, far below, the iron pole of her beacon still standing, though the tower around it was gone. She thought of her goats and her small, ruined house, and felt a pang that was not quite grief and not quite relief, because some things need to be taken by the wind before you can admit you were tired of holding them. "I have no tower now," she said quietly, and she looked at the carved names on the wall, and at the scale bed, and at the man who had never let anyone sleep in his lair, and had carried her in from the storm himself. "I have nowhere to keep the light anymore." He stepped closer and tucked a strand of her gray-tinged hair behind her ear, with a hand that trembled slightly, not from cold but from the effort of being gentle after a lifetime of being terrible. "You kept a light for ships that never thanked you," he answered, and his voice dropped to something that was almost a vow. "Let me keep a light for you for a change. Mara Quill, if you will let a dragon learn how to be a house instead of just a hall of old names." They left the lair together at noon, not because the lair cast them out, but because the coast needed to see that its keeper had not been taken after all. He carried her again for the short flight, because her ankles still would not bear her, and because he had discovered he liked the way she fit against his chest when she was not afraid, and the fishermen on the rocks below stopped mending their nets to stare, and then to kneel without being told. Mara did not want them to kneel and told them so loudly enough that her voice carried over the surf. "Get up, you fools, there is work to do, the tower is down," and the dragon behind her made a sound that in any other throat would have been a laugh. The Empire sent riders 3 days later, because an emperor missing for 3 days is a crisis, and an emperor returning with a limping signal keeper in his arms is a story that will be told for 100 years. They found Calum not in the palace but on the cliff, hauling stone with his own hands alongside Mara and half the village, building not a tower but a small, low house with a very strong lantern room and a very large dragon-sized porch. He had taken off his crown and left it in the spire, because crowns are poor things to build with, and he had kept the tin cup because some debts are better remembered than displayed. On the first night the new light burned, Mara slept not in the spire, but in her own bed with the door open and the sea air coming in, and the dragon slept curled around the house with one wing over the roof, because a promise kept for 3 years deserves more than a single night's shelter. The old law that no one sleeps in the lair was not broken, it was rewritten, because the stone had finally found a name it wanted to keep, and it carved it itself in the warmest part of the wall, shallow and careful, in letters that a woman who mends nets could read without stumbling. Mara Quill, who kept the light when no one paid her to. And below it, In a different hand that shook a little less than before, Calum Rook, who finally found his way home because it was still burning. She had never asked to sleep in a legend. He had never let anyone sleep in his lair. He carried her in from the storm himself, and then he learned how to stay.